Hey, it's Jack. Sitting with me is my friend Joe Fye. He's got a podcast, Radio Free BTC. Joe, what is your podcast about?
Bitcoin.
That's cool. Do you cover other things like Minnesota politics?
Bitcoin.
What about national politics?
Bitcoin.
Do you ever get into sports? I don't talk about it a lot, but people love sports. Do you ever talk about sports?
Bitcoin.
Okay. There you have it. If you want a podcast about only Bitcoin, download Radio Free BTC wherever podcasts are sold.
It's the Jack Tomczak Show.
Welcome back to the Jack Tomczak Show. Now over the phone we have Dr. John Spry, our show's economist, in to explain a couple things. First, we're going to talk inflation, and then second, we're going to talk about the St. Paul rent control thing that just passed. So let's start with inflation, John. I've seen things. Well, I'll back up. Hi, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing okay.
Good. I don't know if you've been listening, John, since I got back on the radio, but I don't know what to believe anymore. And I look at social media and I got some outlets say one thing and some outlets say the complete opposite. And all of my right-leaning friends are saying, inflation and it's going to be bad soon. Get your seed buckets, get your bullets. I hope you have gold. And then I read something the other day that said inflation's a good thing, which is counterintuitive to me. So I thought I should talk to my expert. And then here you are. So now you're up to speed.
Okay. So is inflation a good thing? No. And for this, I'd like to appeal to those geniuses at the 1970s Saturday Night Live. They did a skit during our last bout of very bad inflation, much worse inflation in the 1970s.
Okay.
Under first President Ford and then Carter. And they were trying to make the case that inflation was good. So they had Saturday Night Live's portrayal of Jimmy Carter say, wouldn't you like to smoke $70 cigars, drive a $600,000 car? And the joke is, no, you can't sell inflation as good. Inflation.
Wouldn't you like to be a millionaire podcaster?
Yes, that's part of it. But of course, what inflation is the flip side of the coin of debasing the currency. So what we have in the US, and I think it's just good to start with a couple facts.
Yes.
Is from October 2020 to October 2021, the consumer price index went up about 6.2%. That, for a lot of young people, is pretty high. That's something people that have lived through the 70s are like, oh yeah, wait until it gets to double digits. That's some real inflation. But it's gone up very quickly because during the start of the pandemic, the inflation rate was basically zero.
So what we're saying, 2 years ago, year and a half ago?
Yeah. A year and a half ago, the inflation rate was just barely above zero, and it has gone up to 6.2%. And of course, it's important to understand inflation is the general or the average change in prices.
Okay.
So
if it's a general or average change in prices, does that mean that some prices are inflating higher and some are lower? Okay.
And so hamburger prices, chicken, except at Costco, has been going up at a double-digit pace.
Okay.
That doesn't mean inflation is double-digit. There's actually one good that has been having drops in price over the last year. And it's kind of shocking because it used to be one of the products with the highest inflation rate or highest price increase in our economy, and that is college textbooks.
Really?
Yes, college textbooks for years and years and years used to be going up even faster than college tuition.
Okay.
or the cost of going to the doctor. But recently, in the last couple of years, the price of college textbooks has dropped.
Now, what accounts for that?
Oh, for the college textbook, it's technological change. Is instead of buying the big, thick book,
Mm-hmm.
that you have to print the book. Imagine if you could produce the book and you don't have any printing costs.
Yeah.
That's what the new digital technology has done. So you would expect in basic economics, right? If the cost of producing a textbook drops because you don't have to run it through a printing press,
Mm-hmm.
you just run it through a PDF reader, you'd expect the price to drop.
Yeah.
So, it's true with our 6.2% inflation that's the average. Textbook prices are actually dropping because we have figured out how to make textbooks without a literal printing press.
All right.
But
my job in this is to interject my hilarious personal stories
yes,
within your smart people talking. When I was in college, I would buy the textbook and then sell it at the end of the year. And as I got further into college, I think my senior year, I bought the textbooks the first semester, never opened them, and then sold them at the end of that semester. And by the last semester, I just didn't buy the books because I'm like, I'm not going to open them anyway. So why lose the money? I wish they had been PDFs back then. Continue.
no, but I mean, right. I mean, that kind of gives you an idea. Different prices can change. So we want to acknowledge the truth that, yeah, the price of some things has been dropping.
Okay.
The price of computers has been dropping.
Yep.
But at the same time, the price of a lot of food, especially proteins like hamburger, steak, chicken, those prices have gone up. Energy prices.
So
Have you noticed that at the gas pump for your
I have.
hilarious
I
story?
have.
Have
And
you
if- and if
figured out how
anybody-
to buy gas for less than $3 a gallon?
Costco. How are
Or
their
Sam's
prices?
Club?
Yeah.
But no,
Um,
if you just go to the corner gas station, it's over $3, isn't it?
Yep. And if anybody knows how to get those Biden stickers that says I did that, reach out to me because I would like to put those on gas pumps. Now, a question for you, John. In the 10 years we've been having these conversations where where you try to explain basic economics to me, and I keep asking the same questions. We've talked about how prices do come down, like in terms of technology. A flat screen TV 20 years ago would cost you $30,000, and now they're very inexpensive. When people are figuring out the rate of inflation, does a product that used to be expensive and now is inexpensive, does that figure into inflation, even though it's just because they're getting better at making them cheaper? Like, does that figure into the math or not?
Yes, Jack. And
Really?
now you've highlighted actually an important regularity in the data.
That was not intentional. You're welcome.
Whether inflation is low or moderate, and it's important to point out that for most people's lives, inflation has been bouncing around 2 to 3%. It goes a little bit lower, it goes a little bit higher, but it's been bouncing around that level. But when you break out inflation in different categories, right? We know college tuition has been going up a lot.
Mhm.
Doctor visits has been going up faster than other things. Textbooks were going up faster until the last couple of years. But durable goods, think about appliances.
Mhm.
And Jack, you're probably so old, you remember TV repairmen.
Yes.
There aren't many.
You could go to DeVry and get a degree in TV VCR repair.
Right? Nobody is getting a VCR repaired because it's streaming now. So that doesn't wear out.
Mm-hmm.
And for your TV, they're getting so much better that by the time you have a 12-year-old TV, do you want to repair a 12-year-old TV, or is it better to just get a new TV at these lower prices?
It's certainly easier. And I don't know about this, but because I don't know how much it would cost to fix a TV, but it's probably cheaper to buy a new one than it is to fix one. If you can find somebody who could fix it.
Yeah, because if you have a 12-year-old TV, it's probably not like a 4K TV.
Right.
That was when there were HD TVs, and that was amazing.
Mhm.
But now the 4K TV has 4 times the detail.
Yeah.
So in general, when we look at prices, durable goods have been seeing their prices in many cases drop, and durable good inflation is almost always a lower number than services.
Okay.
Like going to the doctor.
Yep.
Or other insurance services.
Okay.
So there's that difference. What is shocking to people that can't remember the 1970s is 6.2 is really high. The only time in living memory for college students inflation was near that was in June 2008, we hit 5% inflation year over year.
And was that
was the Great Recession.
okay? Was that after the Great Recession or before the Great Recession started?
That's right in the middle of it.
Okay.
And then boom, we actually went to a deflationary period, and prices dropped. If you remember the Great Recession, gas prices were really high. So your listeners that know about politics, part of the reason Senator McCain picked Sarah Palin was she was from an energy producing state, Alaska.
Yep.
And when gas prices were really high, that was thought, oh, we'll get somebody with experience with energy production, being the governor of Alaska, a huge energy producer. But by the time the election was held, gas prices were plunging. And everybody was worried that the stock market plunged, and people weren't worried as much about energy as like the great financial crisis of 2008 and then 2009.
All right,
So,
hang tight, Dr. John Spry. We are going to take a very quick break, pay some bills, and come back. We'll pick up this conversation. You're listening to the Jack Tomczak Show on AM 1280, The Patriot. Welcome back to the Jack Tomczak Show. I'm Jack Tomczak. I'm talking with Dr. John Spry, our show's economist, about inflation, whether or not it's happening and whether or not it is a good thing, and then all the details that are underneath that. And we left off, John, talking about how in June of 2008, inflation was at 4.9%, and then it plummeted, and John McCain had picked Sarah Palin to be vice presidential candidate because she was coming from an oil producing state, and that was relevant. And then, like before the election, it wasn't relevant anymore.
Right. So we had the election in the middle of like a stock market collapse.
Maverick. Yes.
Yes. So, but that's the last time. And if you look at inflation, I think now, right? Inflation's not a good thing.
Right.
Okay. One of the things it does is it messes up the price signals. If you see higher prices, that's usually a signal not to buy something. But if you just go to the store and see, oh, wow, a pound of hamburger is more expensive, you're trying to figure out, does that mean hamburger prices really went up or the price of everything went up? So that adds some confusion. Obviously, if you have saved your money in a bank account, if you own bonds,
okay,
that's going to be bad for people that have made the loans. Because right when you buy a CD at the bank, think about like a grandma. Okay, it has a fixed rate that the grandma is going to get on the loan, and now they're actually losing money because the inflation rate's higher than the like 1.5% you would get on a CD.
So if you're with a CD, you're getting 1.5%, and inflation goes up, you're still getting
6.2%.
You're still getting 1.5%, but that 1.5% is worth less than it was when you started the investment.
Exactly. So you have a real loss.
Okay.
That's not too complex. So I
get around this by not investing anything.
I don't think anybody that's trying to do anything but make political points wants to argue inflation is good. And
well, here's the thing that I read, and I can't remember where I found it. But the argument it was making is that inflation for you isn't that big of a deal, but inflation for people who have like the super rich, it's a bad deal for them because there's more money in the percentages. So I would argue that inflation is bad for everybody. Is it worse for people who've got more money at play?
Oh, it depends very much if your money's in real estate, like say former President Trump.
Okay.
Because real estate prices will go up with inflation.
Yeah.
Okay. Versus like a very conservative grandma investor that has all the money in the bank and CDs. It's particularly bad for people owning bonds, and it's bad for the whole society. So fortunately, and you can say a little prayer tonight and thank God that you're not in Venezuela.
I do every day.
Because they would love to have 6.2% inflation.
What is it there?
They have hyperinflation that, I'm not kidding you, is so bad they had to create new currency by literally lopping zeros off all of the old currency. They have had inflation of 1,000,000%.
Jeez.
Can you imagine that?
No.
Now, this is again, right? Sometimes people will make this point that's wrong. That, oh, like inflation's awesome because all those people that have money in the bank, well, when you have 1,000,000% inflation, you basically have no money in the bank. You may have saved and put that money aside, and now you're an old grandma, and that's supposed to like pay for you in your old age. With 1,000,000% inflation, you have no buying power. So the people of Venezuela, I think we've talked about this, they have had all kinds of unimaginable hardship, including not losing weight like Americans who want to lose weight, but the average Venezuelan has lost like 20 pounds because they just aren't getting food. There are stories of the kids that have medical needs and they're just not met because of the hyperinflation in Venezuela. So nobody wants hyperinflation.
So at 1,000,000% inflation, John, who's left with anything? Like you'd have to be like, is there any amount of wealth where you're left standing with 1,000,000% inflation? And do those people even live in Venezuela?
Yeah, if you're the dictator and you've taken your assets out of Venezuela and have them in a Swiss bank account in Swiss currency, then you weren't as affected by the hyperinflation. But it's just absolutely, hyperinflation is horrible. Venezuela is a famous example. The other famous example is the Weimar Republic.
Germany?
The government in Germany before Hitler, they printed so much money that it took a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. So I think it's good to know what causes inflation. And so if your listeners don't know, Nobel Prize winner, former University of Minnesota professor Milton Friedman,
local angle.
He went to Washington, D.C., and he gave a great lecture right in the Bureau of Engraving where the giant printing presses are. And Milton Friedman can tell us what causes inflation.
The reason we have inflation in the United States, or for that matter, anywhere in the world, is because these pieces of paper and the accompanying book entry, or their counterparts in other nations, are growing more rapidly than the quantity of goods and services produced. The truth is, inflation is made in one place and one place only, here in Washington. This is the only place where there are presses like this that turn out these pieces of paper we call money.
So, right, the government is the only people that are legally allowed to print money. Anybody else doing it is called a counterfeiter. And we know how much trouble you can get into for counterfeiting money.
Yes.
And so what needs to happen it's an easy prescription to say. It's harder for our government sometimes to do this. And that is the Federal Reserve needs to slow down the growth of the money supply. And what markets are anticipating, and markets are looking forward, what markets are anticipating is that the Federal Reserve will cut back on its bond buying. You know how during the pandemic, the Federal Reserve went out and bought a lot of bonds? When you
If you
buy
say
anything,
so,
what
yes.
do you use to buy? You use money, right?
Yeah.
So they literally print the money and then use the money they just printed to buy the bonds. Okay. So the Fed needs to stop that.
Yeah.
Okay. Stop the bond buying. And actually the Fed says they're going to start stopping that. And then they're going to raise interest rates and slow the growth of money. This is what the market expects to happen in the future.
Okay.
This is painful. Some economists, I think I was former Fed Chairman Arthur Burns, called it taking away the punch bowl, the spiked punch bowl,
Yep.
just when the party's getting good. So now in the US economy, our political leaders, whoever's in power, they want the economy to be growing, right?
Yep.
And so slowing down the growth of the money supply, raising interest rates, that's not super popular in and of itself, because that's going to make it harder to buy a house, because your mortgage rates will go up, your car loans will go up, etc. But the market thinks that inflation over the next 10 years won't be the 6.2% where it is now.
Okay.
The market thinks the Federal Reserve, and we don't even know who's going to be leading the Federal Reserve, because President Biden needs to appoint somebody, and then that new appointee has to be confirmed by the US Senate. But the market thinks inflation is going to be 2.7% on average over the next 10 years. So that's what people think will happen. What gives you the really high inflation is when the Federal Reserve is like, the party's doing really good, I don't want to take away the punch bowl. So we saw this in the 1970s. People will say, well, it's heartless. Why would you raise interest rates? That's going to make it harder to borrow money to buy a car. That'll make it harder to borrow money to start a business. But if you don't control the growth of the money supply, you get, and this is what we had in the 70s, that double-digit inflation. And I remember how horrible it was, because my grandpa used to give me a dime. And of course, it was the 70s, so kids were allowed to like roam the streets of small towns. And I could walk across the street to the penny candy counter, and I could get 10 pieces of candy in the 1970s. But a couple of years of double-digit inflation, and all of a sudden, like the amount of candy I would get, because my grandpa still gave me a dime, it got cut in half. My buying power shrunk. And I felt that as a little kid. And this is what families are feeling. Nobody really likes inflation. But the way you get rid of inflation is discipline and how much you run the printing press.
Yeah. Now, does the Federal Reserve, how do they make the decision on interest rates? Is that something the Fed chair unilaterally decides? Ooh, and hang on, we're up against the clock. Let's take a break real quick. We'll come back. We'll finish talking about inflation. And for those of you enjoying this, it's way cheaper than paying tuition at a college. You're very fortunate. Hang tight. You're listening to Jack Tomczak Show on AM 1280 The Patriot. Welcome back to the Jack Tomczak Show. I'm talking with Dr. John Spry, our show's economist, about inflation and how at some point here the Fed is going to have to raise interest rates to curb inflation, and that's going to hurt, but it's a good thing. It's necessary. And going to the break, John, I asked what how do they decide to raise interest rates? Is this something the Fed chair just does? Is the Fed chair accountable to anyone?
Okay,
'Cause I don't think
this is a great
that person
question.
is.
So that's Chairman Powell. You probably still think it's Alan Greenspan. He's
I do.
really old.
I do think it's still
No.
Alan Greenspan.
No, Powell is the Fed chairman right now. The Federal Reserve and its monetary policy is set by what they call the Open Market Committee.
Okay.
And that has 7 Federal Reserve governors in Washington, D.C., and 5 regional bank presidents, the president of the New York Federal Reserve. And then it rotates, and it can include the head of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, Neil Kashkari.
Okay.
So that is a little bit different than some places because the Federal Reserve has a little bit of a regional structure. You're familiar down by the river, we have the Federal Reserve building.
Yeah.
And so when the Federal Reserve changes interest rates, they have their 12 Federal Reserve banks from San Francisco to Boston, from Minneapolis to Atlanta,
okay,
and Dallas. And they vote. Now, what usually happens is all of those Fed leaders come together, they have their meeting, and Chairman Powell, whoever's the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, remember it was Janet Yellen in the past, they propose this is what we should do. And then they end up having a vote, and they usually try to reach a consensus among the 12 voting members.
okay,
And if you don't agree, then there'll be a dissent. So it's not quite like the judiciary, but you will see a Federal Reserve statement. This is what we've done to monetary policy, and this is why. And then whether there's dissent or not, there could be a second note when there is dissent, where a bank governor says, this is what I think we should have done.
okay. Why don't they, like, if lowering interest rates leads to pain,
No,
why don't
raising
they-
interest rates leads to short-term pain,
you said, right, raising interest rates leads to short-term pain.
right? Because that makes
Okay.
borrowing
Yeah.
money more expensive, and it
I-
tends to slow down like car sales, and it tends
So-
to slow down housing construction.
why not do that before we get to 6.2% inflation? Wouldn't there be less pain in the correction if you did it earlier?
So this is a good thing to point out, Jack. When we look at the history of what has happened, the Federal Reserve has projected that inflation would be low, like around 2%, maybe a little bit higher than 2%. And then we actually got maybe like double or 250% higher inflation than what they forecasted. So one of the things you've learned in talking to me for 10 years is economists are pretty terrible at forecasting. Okay. And the Federal Reserve, Chairman Powell, the other Federal Reserve leaders, they didn't think inflation was going to get to 6.2%.
Okay.
So
Did you, John?
no, 6.2%. I did not. If you would have asked me a year ago, is inflation going to 6.2%? I would have not had that number.
Okay.
So I want to be honest, like we missed. And so what we're seeing here is like a golfer that always is hitting the ball into the lake to the right of the fairway.
Okay.
If you always are making that mistake on this round of golf, what might you start doing, Jack?
Trying to hit it to the left of where you have been hitting it.
Yeah, you might like not try to like just go down that fine
Yeah, you
border of
aim left
fairway
to try to go
versus
straight.
exactly. And so I think one of the things they need to do is realize that expectations for inflation have been going up really since the pandemic.
Okay.
So in the like as the pandemic goes on, people's expectations of inflation are going up, maybe even faster than the Fed's forecast for inflation. So they're missing right now by thinking inflation is going to be lower than it's turning out to be.
Okay.
And then I wanted to say something that I did hear the Biden administration point out. If you look at the unemployment rate, we're back where we were before the pandemic.
Really?
Yeah, so we had like the shortest recession ever. As we said, right, with the pandemic, we're shutting stuff down in March and April 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when we did that, all the bartenders, people working in hotels, they didn't have a job. We had a spike in unemployment over 14%.
I've got this figured out because I was at Walgreens today and waited. It was a 2-hour ordeal to get a prescription filled. And the dude taking my money said, "We're a little behind. It's just the pharmacist and me." And they were advertising for a pharmacy technician person in the window. And then I was at Burger King. I'm not proud of myself, for breakfast. And they're also hiring. Unemployment rate has gone down, not because people are back to work, but because people are stopped looking for jobs. Am I right? So am I right?
So in terms of the unemployment rate is back to normal. What's not back to normal is the number of people with jobs, just like you said, based on your observation.
It took a decade, but I've learned things.
More people have left the labor market.
Left the labor market. That's the thing when politicians say good things about the unemployment rate, that they neglect that part.
No, we have a shortage of about 6 million jobs. The unemployment rate for people that want a job is kind of back to normal and isn't particularly high. We have 6 million fewer jobs than what you would have thought about before the pandemic.
Okay.
And that's right. That's a combination of people retiring early. That's a combination of different kinds of jobs existing. It's really hard to hire people. And again, like it's not just prices, but wages are going up. So we're kind of seeing in Minnesota that like wages go up, but prices went up about the same amount.
Mm-hmm.
So it's after inflation, it's not like a huge gain. But in terms of what the Federal Reserve is doing, they have been missing, definitely over the last year, maybe over the last year and a half, their inflation forecast. They thought inflation was going to be lower. And if you thought inflation was going to be lower, you would have a looser monetary policy. You would have the Federal Reserve buy bonds by printing money. But now that inflation is higher, the Federal Reserve really needs to get ready, and it's not just a one-time thing, to have a policy of a tighter monetary policy until you can get back down to about 2% inflation. Because what you want is to not have people thinking about inflation or talking about inflation. If you have a fairly low and a stable inflation rate, then prices slightly change, but some prices go up, some prices go down. And it just helps people make better decisions because you're not also like worrying about inflation. And for a lot of people, especially young people, we haven't had to worry too much about inflation since the 1980s. but it's
Yeah.
like all of a sudden it's like the 70s are back.
Yeah, and I was too in 1980, so my experience in the 70s was largely positive, though I don't remember walking. Like I didn't feel like I could go anywhere I wanted to back then, but my needs were provided for. But I remember like when I was a grown up, I started buying houses, and there was no money down or very little required down. I'd hear stories from older people like back in the day, you actually had to have money first before you could buy a house. And I don't know, maybe we're heading back to that. So we got like a minute left here. We can continue into the next segment, but we're not, given that the Fed is bad at predicting things and economists are bad at predicting things, and are we ever in danger of ending up where Venezuela is? Like even the people who disagree with us politically, they're not going to, like, even the worst liberal Democrat in the world is not going to want to print money so much that we have 1,000,000% inflation, right?
Yeah, nobody's ever going to say that. But you can get in really bad habits. So
Okay,
if anybody's
we'll
ever
do bad
thought
habits
about
when we come back.
addiction,
We'll do bad habits on the
talk
other side of
about
the break, and we'll
addiction.
talk about St. Paul as well. You're listening to the Jack Tomczak Show on AM 1280 The Patriot. Welcome back to the Jack Tomczak Show. I'm talking with our show's economist, Dr. John Spry, about inflation, and at some point we'll get to St. Paul rent control. One more segment, John. 8 minutes. Don't let me distract you. Before we move on to St. Paul, how does 1,000,000% inflation not happen in this country? What do we need to do?
One of the really key things, we were talking about how the Federal Reserve works, is that the Federal Reserve has independence. So the printing press isn't directly controlled by President Biden or the US Congress. The US Congress, our president, we've passed laws creating the Federal Reserve structure we talked about earlier. And the Federal Reserve is given their mandate of what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to, according to the law in the United States, preserve price stability and seek maximum employment.
Okay.
So basically the Congress, the president, gives the mission to the Federal Reserve, but they're afraid that if any president, President Trump, President Biden, etc., actually could control monetary policy, they would be a little bit giddy and want to keep interest rates low, the money supply growing right before their election.
Yeah.
Because they like to get reelected.
Yep.
And so it's basically a commitment device, just like you don't have 50 gallons of ice cream in your freezer if you're worried that you'll eat it at night.
Yep.
So that's a huge difference. A lot of the countries that have hyperinflation, the government just directly starts printing money with the leader of the country not having an independent central bank.
Yeah, and if our country had that, if there was political influence on interest rates, regardless of party, I don't care who you are, I don't even care how good of a person you are, there's no politician who wouldn't succumb to that temptation to mess with interest rates to influence their legacy, their reelection, you name it.
And the beauty for the politicians is this way, the president can always say, I want the interest rates to be lower. I want the money supply to grow.
I'm with you, but the Fed, I've got no control over that. Yeah. So in reality, like it's okay for them politically because they can push the blame off on Janet Yellen or Greenspan, whoever's in charge of that thing now. I don't know.
How?
Whatever.
So
Colin Powell, I thought he died.
No,
that's a joke, John.
It's okay. So I got another joke for you.
Okay.
The federal, we've talked about this before, the federal debt as a share of our GDP or our national income.
Yep.
We hit a peak of basically 136%. So think about this as like taking your mortgage, your credit cards, your house loan, and all the money you owe is 136% of what you make.
Now, because I've got a mortgage on my house, my debt to GDP, my debt it's probably Well, it is more than 136%.
Wow.
Is my house.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that on the public airways, Jack.
Well, I owe, I don't know. I bought my house 2 years ago. I probably owe 90% of it. And that 90% of the cost of my house is more than I make in a year. So isn't my debt to
Yeah.
GDP ratio out of whack?
And so for most of the of your life, that ratio has been more like 50% or 65%.
Okay, John, that
But
seems bad.
it has spiked to 136%. But President Biden could point out that now it's down to only 125%. Can you believe while running large deficits, our debt to income ratio has actually dropped over the last year?
Yes, because the economy's good because people are still spending money when they're sitting at home because of the COVID.
Oh, more than that, Jack.
Okay.
Because Uncle Sam and Jack Tomczak both have massive debt. So if you have a lot of debt, like the federal government,
Mhm.
and inflation is high, the inflation kind of wipes out some of your debt.
Ew.
This
It's
is
a
one of the
trick.
reasons places like Venezuela get in the inflation problem in the first place, is instead of being honest with their citizens and say, if you want a government that will do all these things for you, we're going to tax you like you're Dutch, which is a really high rate of taxation.
The old taxi like you're Dutch saying, yep.
They are like, we'll give you all this stuff, but then they don't have the money to pay for it. And actually in Venezuela, they ran out of the money to pay the European printer to print up new money. That's when you know you have an inflation problem.
Yep.
That's a heck of an inflation problem. But the guy, right, it's always tempting for the government, instead of having to have a tax and say members of Congress are going to vote like they did this week to raise taxes,
Mm-hmm.
to say, oh, we'll vote to spend the money, we won't vote to tax people, and we'll pay for the spending by being the government and running the printing press. That's always the danger. I do not think that is what's going to happen in the US. The market thinks that inflation is going to be like not 6.2%, but on average 2.7% over the next 10 years. But what everybody's counting on is that the Federal Reserve will actually behave differently than in the 1970s, especially the early 1970s, and will take away the punch bowl.
Okay.
And not let us have a big party. But you know what happens when you get inflation? You get political pressure for price controls. And that's what we've seen in St. Paul and Minneapolis.
All right. And I lied. We're doing one more segment. Do you have time? Okay. We got 2 more minutes left of this one. I'm going to ask some inflation questions. Then in the next segment, we'll move on to rent control. John, if the federal government and the Fed, if they can print money and borrow money with impunity, why do they collect taxes? If what we pay in taxes does not pay for what the government spends, why even do it?
Because when in the US, when they've created high inflation, the American voter hates that. The only people that hate inflation more than the American voter is probably the German voter. Because the German voters know that when they had hyperinflation, they first suffered. And think about how awful it would be. You want a loaf of bread for your kids, and you have to literally wheel a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread. Doesn't that just sound awful?
It does.
And to the
Germans too, so I don't even.
That's not even the worst part. Is after the inflation, you get a horrible, evil, tyrannical, genocidal dictator.
Yeah.
So the Germans are like, no, we cannot have inflation. It is better to pay taxes for the government we vote for than to try to pretend that we can have government spending without taxes, because
Well, for
that's the
once-
road to inflation.
Yeah, I agree with the Germans on this one. We should be paying for the government we have and pay as we go and avoid getting ourselves into long-term problems and risking Nazis. All right, John, let's take a break. We'll come back. Then I promise we're talking St. Paul rent control. I'm Jack Tomczak. You're listening to AM 1280, The Patriot. Welcome back to the Jack Tomczak Show on AM 1280, The Patriot. I'm talking with Dr. John Spry. The first hour, we talked about inflation. It was going to be one segment, and I'm glad it went the whole hour because if I had these questions, other people had these questions. And what I like about you, John, along with the other experts I have, is when I don't believe what the mainstream media is telling me, when I don't believe what I'm getting on social media, I go to somebody who spent their lives becoming an expert on the thing that I want to learn about. So I appreciate you, John, more than you will ever know.
And Jack,
Okay.
I just want to emphasize humility, because neither the Federal Reserve nor I predicted a year ago we'd be at 6.2% inflation.
Okay.
So I think it's important to realize one of the basic facts is our ability to forecast inflation is not always so good.
What do you think gets in the way of being able to forecast it accurately?
Events. That one of the things that affects inflation is like literally what the government does, like what the Federal Reserve does with their monetary policy. And so if you had thought the Federal Reserve was already going to start tightening monetary policy more than they actually did, that would cause you to underpredict inflation and have higher inflation now than you thought.
So last inflation question, before we get to St. Paul's rent control and other price controls. I got the mortgage on my house 2 years ago, and I've got whatever interest rate I have. And that interest rate was set in 2019 dollars. And if I don't refinance that, by the time I pay that off in inflated future dollars, I'm paying less because of inflation, correct?
Yeah,
Paying less than I would have without inflation.
Yeah, so one of the things the surprise inflation does is it transfers wealth away from little old ladies buying CDs at the bank to people that have borrowed money. And apparently the two people that borrow a lot of money in our economy are Jack Tomczak and his Uncle Sam.
It's a family problem.
But then you get rising prices. And so one of the questions where it kind of ties into inflation is, have you ever thought, why was the rent control in St. Paul and Minneapolis passed now and not like 10 years ago when inflation was lower? Is that
because
a good question?
people are starting to feel price increases and are getting nervous, so they want some type of governmental protection that the prices in where they live are not going to rise with the rest of them.
Yeah, and this isn't just St. Paul and Minneapolis. I think if you look at history, periods of high inflation often create a political constituency for price controls. And again, the definition of a price control is when the government sets a price instead of letting the market choose prices. The government sets the price. And of course, prices are powerful incentives. If you see a high price of rent in St. Paul and you see, oh, wow, rent in St. Paul seems really high, and you're an entrepreneur and you think, I could build some housing, and it won't be single family homes for people like Jack that own it with a mortgage, but it'll be rental housing. And I can rent this housing and it's a good financial project.
Okay.
A high price for rent has the seeds of its own cure in it, because it creates a huge incentive for people to invest in providing more apartments to rent. That's pretty simple, isn't it?
Yes.
You even got that.
Yes.
You're actually doing really well, Jack.
I am in Mensa, whatever.
Okay. So what St. Paul has done is actually one of the strictest rent controls in the entire US.
Yes.
So rents can only go up 3%. And that's for not just existing apartments, but new construction.
And what it's lacking that other cities have is that in other cities, new construction gets does not have to abide by the rent control for right away. So it gives them an opportunity to make their money back. And that's not the
Right.
case in St. Paul, right?
Yeah, and so literally in my neighborhood of St. Paul, there are 3 construction projects that in the absence of rent control would have had people working building stuff.
Yep.
But they have to get financing. They have to get a loan from a bank.
Mm-hmm.
And what bank wants to make a loan to build rental housing in the city of St. Paul? Wouldn't it be a lot safer to build rental housing in Mendota Heights or Oakdale or Falcon Heights?
And the banks who lend money to these projects and the companies that build these projects and the people who come up with these projects and want to do it, it's like they're not going to be building housing. They're just not going to be doing it in St. Paul. They're going to do it in environments that are more hospitable to them, correct?
Right. So, and they may build housing in St. Paul for single family homes,
Yep.
not affected by rent control, but
Mhm.
building new rental properties. And so it's not just me, but if you go to the Chicago Booth School of Business, they do a survey of economists. And this is one of the things where economists like pretty much all agree that rent control does not have a positive effect on the housing market. So what we're seeing in St. Paul is just the start of the bad things that happen with rent control, because you're messing around with prices. Maybe because you had inflation. That's how New York got rent control. New York rent control started during a period of high inflation, and it is still there. And it's a general principle. It's not just about the market for rent. So if we look at another government, you're familiar with the Taliban.
I am.
Right? So
Yep.
the Taliban, I wouldn't say they're like scholars of economics. And I wouldn't say they understand economics any more than the supporters of rent control in St. Paul. So they thought it was unfair that ticket prices on airplane flights to and from Afghanistan were too high. So just like rent control sets a maximum rent,
Mm-hmm.
the Taliban had airplane price controls and set a maximum price for a seat on the airplane. Guess what the Taliban, those geniuses, got? No airplanes.
Yeah.
And the Taliban is like, no, you can't factor in the cost of doing business. We just think it should be fair. So we think that the ticket price should be low. And the airlines are, wait, we can't fly and pay the insurance to fly to Afghanistan for that price.
I have
So
these
by-
conversations, John, with my children when they want something just because they want it. It's
So
like,
what,
well, that daddy can't afford that. So you wanting it doesn't really matter right now.
right? So what the geniuses at the Taliban's government ministries in Kabul have done is create a price control that has ended the airline industry in Afghanistan.
Way to go. Now you
that
would never
happens quickly because, right, airplanes literally fly, right? So they're
Yeah.
not going to fly to Afghanistan and lose money.
No.
Now, with rent control, there are some rental units where the landlord can't move the apartment out of St. Paul the way an airline can move an airplane out of
Yeah,
a
that
country.
apartment is stuck in St. Paul. It's taped to the ground.
And what's really sad, if you don't believe me, go and take a look at what rent control did to the Bronx. You still got to pay the property tax if
Yep.
you're the landlord. Every now and then you need to make repairs. Well, it got to the point in the Bronx where landlords were like, no, I can't even run this apartment and cover my costs. And so then They walked away from it.
Wow.
There's no more landlord, there's no more repairs, and your city starts looking like it's bombed out. That's not going to happen the first year. That takes year after year and decades of rent control to get to the point where the market price of housing, and it's this great ironic thing, the cost of housing and being able to have affordable housing in New York, that's really hard to ever find.
Okay.
Even Jerry Seinfeld made episodes that were hilarious about how hard it is to find an apartment in New York City, despite rent control that's supposed to keep the price of the apartment low.
So why do they do it? Why do they do it? Why does St.
Why
Paul
did the
do this if they
Taliban
can see
do
in
a
other
price
cities
control?
it doesn't work?
Because they didn't look at history. I think that's a lot of it, is they didn't look at history, and maybe they thought like your kids, although I think your kids are a little bit older and mature, and they should understand reality more than the Taliban or other supporters of price control.
Yes, as far as maturity, it goes my kids, the Taliban, St. Paul City Council. Actually, St. Paul voters, because they did this to themselves.
Yeah, St. Paul voters voted for this, and part of it is people that don't live in St. Paul never got a chance to vote.
Mm-hmm.
So think if you're a migrant, think if you're a refugee. You're a refugee or you're a migrant from California, and you're going to move to Minnesota for opportunity because you're literally getting away from the Taliban and you were helping out the U.S. military.
30 seconds, John, wrap it up.
The rent control is amazingly anti-immigrant.
Yes. Yep.
Because it says, no, not anybody can have this apartment at the low price. It has to be the person that was there when the rent control started. So it creates these tremendous barriers to upward mobility. And I don't want that. You don't want that. But the Taliban and the rent control advocates in St. Paul are getting that.
Thank you very much, Dr. John Spry. We love having you on. We'll have you on again soon, I hope. When we return, we'll talk to Republican gubernatorial candidate Michelle Benson.